My day job is a senior investment strategist at Acadian. I should probably also mention that I moonlight as the co-editor of the Journal of Financial Data Science, along with Frank Fabozzi and Marcos Lopez de Prado. And I mentioned that for a couple of reasons. One of them is that earlier in the day, one of the audience members had a question about 13F and using that to fashion trading strategies. Actually, in the next issue of JFDS, we will have a paper on that, so check it out. The other reason I mentioned that is that Gordon Ritter, our previous speaker, has been published in our journal, so very happy to see him here today. With that, let me give you the impetus behind this presentation. It's actually an abridged version of a presentation that we give to clients. On the one hand, asset owners, but also serves to useful for new researchers who are maybe making the transition from traditional statistics or a quant, if you will, financial econometrics to machine learning methods. So the real subject matter is methodology and sort of how to structure a research program or project and really good statistical hygiene, as I like to call it. So the two pillars of quantitative investing, as far as Acadian's view, data preparation and signal trading and testing. And why do I bring that up? That seems sort of an obvious truism. Well, this is the case in both traditional econometrics and also in machine learning and AI and data science applications. So I think one of the things that it probably needs clarification or some sort of a view on is, do machine learning methods and data science, et cetera, represent a wholly new approach to quantitative modeling, or can we consider them sort of extensions of our existing analytical and econometric toolkit? Acadian's view, and actually my view before I got to Acadian, which I've written about publicly in articles, is that it makes the most sense in terms of sort of both the research methodology and just sort of conceptual, if you look at the history of econometrics, to view these techniques as being just an extension and the next logical step in the evolution of econometrics. I won't go into too much detail here, but econometrics for a long part of its history was very theoretically oriented, focused on explaining the past. This extends or starts from the Cowles Commission and their sort of victory, if you will, over the NBER, which had a more empirical orientation. Along the way, people like Milton Friedman advanced, an instrumentalist view, a more empirically oriented view of econometrics. But long story short, in academia, and this is a little bit of a generalization and a simplification, the Cowles Commission, the theoretical approach to econometrics, won out. I think with ML and AI, we are positioned for a renaissance in what we call a more empirically oriented version or approach to econometrics. So I'll leave that there. That's more of a philosophical debate. But I want to get out that the two pillars of data of quant investing, data preparation and signal training and testing, are there no matter what kind of framework you're using. So Origin does two case studies, very simple. I call them statistical magic tricks to illustrate potentially how you could go wrong in applying machine learning. And when I mean wrong, I don't mean erroneous results, but results that may make you go back and look at your assumptions, your pre-model work, et cetera. So before we do that, why use ML? I mean, I don't have to explain to a lot of you why we do that, but it warrants repeating potentially. Financial data possesses some unique properties, right? So unlike data that we find in natural science, financial data is marked by certain characteristics. Just think about momentum, mean reversion, volatility clustering, all those things that we know and love in our everyday practice. They are features of financial data that are not present, or at least to the same extent or in the same form, in the data that we find in natural science. Second, dependence between predictors. Again, I don't want to exclude natural science data from natural science from this category, but in general, this is something that plagues or blesses financial data to a large extent, perhaps larger than we find in nature. And then the mixing of continuous and categorical variables, which are often important in different kinds of models, is very prevalent in financial data. Machine learning techniques are often useful in modeling all three of these phenomena successfully. Benefits of using ML and data science to train and test signals. Well, as we all know, in the old days, data science used to be called data mining. So the discovery of more nuanced or complex patterns is really the bread and butter of these techniques that we're very good at. Parallel processing, some algorithms have embedded parallel processing, neural networks, as we all know. And then randomization as a discovery tool. In the old days, people were wowed by genetic algorithms because of the randomization component in them. And to a large extent, these are still novel phenomena to many, not everybody, but to many. And so again, these are some of the sort of the high-level benefits potentially of using these techniques. So the importance of data prep. So our first magic trick, if you will, or case study involves, we want to just simply explain the target variable's behavior with 3 randomly generated features. It's not important how I generated these, just trust me that it's a legitimate time series that could occur in the world. So you have a correlation matrix, you have, this is the target variable volatility, and you see all of the factors, there are 3 of them. They have identical variant volatility as well. You see that the factor correlates to target variable. So one of the factors has a 0.99 linear correlation to the target variable. The other ones have a 0 correlation. So the intuition is that factor 1, number 1, should explain most of the target variable's performance, right? Now, we run a random forest, and we get a surprising result. Factor 3, or feature 3, explains most, is given the highest relative feature importance weight. Even though, if you ran a correlation analysis pre-study, you would have found that it was factor 1 that was the driver of the target variable's performance. So the explanation in this little experiment is that the biggest driver is the nonlinear behavior, or relationship, excuse me, between the target variable and feature 3. So it doesn't mean that our correlation analysis was misguided. It doesn't mean that our random forest was misapplied. But a result like this would make us go back potentially and say, to the point Gordon made, what does our pre-model stage look like? Have we picked the correct variables? Are we more concerned with modeling nonlinear behavior, linear behavior? Does this result that we get from the random forest, does it contradict in sort of unintuitive ways what we found with a more simpler study? So I think what often happens, especially with newer or younger practitioners, is that, or people who are making the transition to ML and data science, is that they expect that the output will be more or less just a more sophisticated version of what they've experienced in applying regression or quantile regression, things of that nature. And I think what people have to be prepared for is that the output could be fundamentally different, but that's not always a bad thing. It just has to be explained. And so part of statistical hygiene is going back and figuring out, how did I put this study together? Does it make sense what I did? Okay? Now, just to show that's not an isolated example with that correlation structure, we'll repeat the experiment. But in this case, again, we have identical volatilities for both target variable and factors or features. But in this case, all of them have the same linear correlation to the target variable, okay? So the intuition is that the factor should explain more or less, they should have equal explanatory power more or less vis-a-vis the target variable. And what do we get? No surprise, or maybe a surprise. Feature 2 explains quite a bit more of the behavior of the target variable than the other 2. Again, it's a sort of a variation on a theme, right? But again, the idea here is that it's important to go back, do the requisite type of data prep, and figure out what is going on. I think, let me stop here and actually just say that one of the things that can be done is that, ML and data science, as they've been sort of gaining popularity over the last, let's say, decade or so, really picking up steam. I think, one of the things that people are really sort of driven to is to discover new factors and sort of new premia, new relationships, because, and I've had people who, run ML dedicated hedge funds tell me, look, we don't need economic theory, that we can just apply these techniques and discover new patterns that are much more powerful and much more revealing. I'm not disputing that, but the risk with that approach is that because we have no experience with some of the new discoveries, if you will, the new output, we have no way of knowing if they're going to actually work, right? Because the track records of most of these funds is very short. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at, I think the sort of the more practical way of going about this, pragmatic way, is to, at least at the beginning, to sort of retread a lot of finance theory and reprocess it, if you will, through these new techniques. So I'll give you an example. If you're looking at an equity factor model, I don't think it's such a bad thing to look at Fama, French, Carhart, or any of the other equity factor models that have been developed, and try to see what these models tell you about those time series that have been discovered, those premia, those factors. So, for example, Ken French has a website. He has free data that he publishes periodically. Taking a different look or a different view, a different angle, a different machine learning take on that data, that information, I think is a great place to begin. I've done it myself. I don't think that's where you end. Obviously, as we're in the first or second inning of this, I would say, maybe third. As the field progresses, I think there will be more novelty in terms of the discoveries. But I think at the beginning, we have to actually properly understand how to apply these things and then move on to more sophisticated work. That's my personal opinion. Our second example, the key takeaway. So, flexibility of ML models can lead to counterintuitive results. So here's basically with freedom comes responsibility. That's the idea there. So imagine an OLS regression. You run that, right? And there's a lot of things that can tell you, a lot of assumptions, right? Independence of errors, the factors, the factors have to be at least linearly independent, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff to tell you along the way. You're making a matrix singular. Go back, do this again, right? So there's limitations, obviously, of a regression. It's a linear model. It gives you the mean sensitivity, sensitive to outliers, a host of things we could cite. But one of the benefits of a traditional model, and this goes for other traditional econometric tools too, like a vector autoregression, is that Garch, et cetera, is that they'll tell you, kind of go back, start over. This is not going to work. I think one of the things you have with ML tools is that over the years, a lot of them have been driven heuristically, right? There's some theory behind them, obviously, but there's a lot of heuristic devices and elements to them. And so there's a lot of flexibility and freedom in the models. And so if you just dump anything into it, you'll get an output. It's not necessarily going to give you, there aren't necessarily the same safeguards there are in a traditional model. It's important to keep in mind that in terms of methodology. Input should be economically relevant and sufficiently unique. So this is, I think, a legit debate that people are having. I think Acadian's view is that the output that you produce and the assumptions of your study should have some economic intuition. There should be sort of a narrative or story, whatever you want to call it, where you understand, at least in the base case, the economic dynamics that are at play. Like I said, there are other firms which have a legitimate point of view that you can throw a lot of economic theory out the door because these things are so good at pattern discovery that you can just apply them wholesale and trade potentially profitably with them without worrying too much about the underlying economic theory. And so it's just a disagreement. I think time will tell after the performance of various funds and strategies evaluated which one, who was right. So potential solution, feature selection, dimension reduction before applying ML. So that point speaks to the fact that a lot of ML frameworks like random forest can help you do feature selection within the actual algorithm. Can do that, but I think it's safer, just from the standpoint of statistical hygiene, as I call it, to actually do a lot of this work pre-model. Gordon mentioned PCA. Lasso is another way of doing some of this to figure out, okay, I've got a set of factors that are at least linearly independent, so I'm safe on that front. Now let me sort of process this with an ML technique and see what happens. Okay, so a little bit more sophisticated example, and I use that word lightly. Suppose we have a sample stream of 5 that returns for 5 factors, okay? We use a randomized search to find portfolios that produce the highest Sharpe ratio. So we basically just randomly generate 1,000 portfolios and we get high to low Sharpe ratios. So here's an example allocation, okay? And the Sharpe ratio of that guy in this was 1.11. So let's classify a high Sharpe ratio portfolio as one that has a Sharpe ratio of greater than 1. And our objective, we're going to apply a tool in the next slide, is to take these characteristics. So the allocations, F1, F2, F3, you see 40%, 20%, et cetera. We're going to consider those as the features that help us, they're information that we can take as inputs into helping us classify high and low Sharpe ratio portfolios in the future, okay? To do that, we're using a well-known framework, a multi-layer perceptron. So nothing too complicated, but it's complicated enough that it's providing some interesting spice relative to some more traditional models. Okay, so like I said, portfolio weights function as features that are used to classify portfolios. These are high Sharpe ratio portfolios or low Sharpe ratio portfolios. This is what like the Excel sheet would look like or whatever. Basically, you have a bunch of columns. You've got the features down the line on each row, and then you have a Sharpe ratio on the right-hand side. And the idea is that, or the intuition is that a collection of asset weights will help us infer a high Sharpe portfolio from a low Sharpe portfolio. So we split our sample into training and test set, 80% to train on, 20% to test. We've got good results. We have a good classifier. Congratulations, pop the champagne. So we can expect that as we go forward, we can use the same methodology to classify high and low Sharpe portfolios once we're presented with totally new data. I'm talking about outside of the test sample. Okay? So we randomly create a new sample. Let's call it a regime for each factor by resampling our original data set. So this is a bootstrap. I can give you the algorithm. I use the Romanum Politis as a stationary bootstrap, 6-month block as the average block size, exponentially distributed. There you go. Okay? You get a new frontier. Lo and behold, we have a lower Sharpe ratio. So it's misclassified now. That same allocation as before is misclassified as is going to classify as a high Sharpe portfolio, but in fact, in the new regime, it's low Sharpe. Okay? This is a really primitive example, but I think there's some important points or takeaways from this, right? One is that overfitting is as much of a risk in financial data science as in traditional econometrics, right? So, the claim is that OLS regression or, like methods will overfit, and it's true, they are. That's why things like ridge regression and so on, generalization techniques, are invoked to inject some bias and reduce that variance between training and test set. We all know that. However, just think about random forest. If your tree depth is too large, you're going to overfit that sample and you're running the same risk. I think people forget that, right? And there's also there's sometimes a view that some of these techniques, you don't have to have that same attention to statistical hygiene or detail and upkeep that you do, but you do, right? So the second point related is that to combat overfitting, sensitivity to regimes needs to be incorporated into models. More regularization techniques, which I just mentioned, can be invoked to make models more generalizable. Now, the third, I think, is the most important takeaway. There's often an added layer of complexity in analyzing data in finance. This is not news compared to the analysis of data from the natural world. But we often forget this, where data often possesses dynamics that can be more easily identified. So just think about this. I'll give you a concrete example. So, 1963 to 1980, you had a high inflation regime, right? If you ran it, it would be I think AR2 as the inflation structure of inflation, CPI. 1980 to 2000 would be AR1 and consider a period of falling inflation, right? And so you model those two periods, you think you have a good idea of what's going to happen after that in terms of just at least inflation, but also just in general the structure of the economy, right? Let's say you ran a Hamilton-style regime switching, right? Which have notoriously poor predictive performance, but let's put that aside. Okay, but you have a good model of the world. And then you get the GFC, and what happens after that? So let's throw out the 2000, 2008. You have unorthodox monetary policy, you've got ZIRP, you've got negative interest rates. You to a large extent have a lot of elements in the global economic regime that you haven't seen before. So that data set is wholly new. It's not training and test, it's brand new. And so what do? Well, I think sophisticated models can help cope with those types of events or occurrences. However, I think just a simplistic application of ML techniques and just running data and sort of passing a bunch of predictive tests, statistical tests, I think is not enough. So time is up, they're telling me. I do have conclusions, but I'll just stop here. You can read them while I take some questions, if any.
This is Raven Pack.